Imagine waking up to a world completely different, where the walls of old are now irrelevant. New world and yet much of the old, the warmth of a new dawn, a lingering cold. How will nations navigate as bipolarity dissipates? I guess it's really anyone's estimate, but a solution they must formulate. And ASEAN will innovate, it will rejuvenate, somewhat reincarnate, so don't you underestimate. Just you wait. Alright guys, welcome to another podcast by DJ Anesh, currently sponsored by no one, although we've hit a landmark with past 100 subscribers, so yay, congrats to myself. Clap, 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 clap. Continue clapping. Oh, still clapping? Okay, I'll wait for a while, I'll wait. Okay, good. Wow, thanks guys for that thunderous applause. I'm glad to be back. I have one last SBQ topic to cover with the podcast series, and then after that I'll be moving into the essays already. And from the intro video to the sort of a poem at the start and all that kind of stuff, I think you can kind of guess what the topic is today, and capping it off our timeline, we are going to all the way towards the end of 2000 already. We've covered some of these conflicts and issues already in previous lectures and tutorials and podcasts, but I thought that it would be a good way to consolidate everything that we have done for SBQ and with ASEAN and with the regional developments leading all the way to the year 2000. What I've done for this lecture series, this particular one, is to try to historicize a time period. And this time period is the post-Cold War world. Of course, the post-Cold War world it arguably extends all the way till today, but given our syllabus, I think that it would extend from 1991 all the way to the year 2000. And I'm trying to look at the character and the type of conflicts and issues that are present in this post-Cold War world, and I kind of want to see if there is a difference or if there are changes, if there are continuities. So the key concept here I'm looking at with regards to ASEAN's development or with regards to the regional development is that of change and continuity. I want to see if the character has changed, if ASEAN has deviated from any of its norms. I want to see how the organization develops when the Cold War ends. And I think I also want to continue to assess ASEAN's effectiveness when it comes to dealing with the different issues that comes into play. One of the strangest things, right, is that, and I'm sure you've heard this before, either from Mr. Loh or Ms. Goh, but ironically enough, in the Cold War, because of bipolarity, it was a really, really stable international relations system. It was a really stable international order. Because, put it simply, the stakes were really, really high for any one party to escalate it into a hot war. And ironically enough, because of superpower status, nuclear warfare, the blocs, ironically enough, it was a really stable system. So bipolarity, paradoxically, could have been seen as something stabilizing. Could have been a stabilizing force. But when we come to the end of the Cold War, we move away from bipolarity and into multipolarity. Or you can also, it's arguable that it is unipolarity, which is that the US emerges out of the Cold War a clear victor, and you can say it's a unipolar world, one that is really dominated by the US and its interests. I think I would agree to that for the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. but subsequently, as we move further and further away from the collapse of the Berlin Wall and across time, I think I think I would see it more as a multipolar world. But again, this is up to you. I think the key thing here is that bipolarity is no longer the international order once the Cold War ends. So looking into this era, I've characterized and I put here for you a number of issues and as well as a number of developments that take place in this short 9 years. This short 9 years is going to be really dynamic and it is going to contain crises that the region has not seen before. It is going to test ASEAN in very, very difficult ways and challenging ways. And at the end of the day, once again, it's left up to you to determine if ASEAN has been effective in dealing with these regional issues. The mandate is still the same. ASEAN is looking after regional affairs. It is looking at the security dimension. It's looking at the economic dimension. It's looking at the social dimension. But this time around, it's a lot more tricky because we have a lot more gray areas. And crucially, I also want you guys to pay particular attention to the ASEAN Way. The ASEAN Way principles, and I'm sure you remember them by heart by now. Yep, I'll give you some time to recite them out aloud. Yep, correct. Yep, and then the next one. Yep, correct. And then the next one. Yeah, good, very good. Okay, so ASEAN Way principles, increasingly they are coming under scrutiny because of the nature of the issues that pop up and the applicability of the ASEAN Way in dealing with these issues is under greater spotlight. So that's something for us to consider as we go into some of the issues that come up in this time period. So some of them, as I said, you've already been through. We have the South China Sea. The South China Sea conflict is a huge security conflict. We've been through like quite a bit of that. And then the other ones like the Hist, the Enlargement of ASEAN, Asian Financial Crisis, and the ASEAN Regional Forum, as well as the regional economy in general, are a bit new, but some of the things might sound familiar to you as well because you have done some source work together with them already. So all these things come in quick succession, and we are really looking at how these issues affect ASEAN. Will it be like dominoes where it leads to the organization being incapacitated and handicapped or brought to its knees? Or are these further opportunities for ASEAN to strengthen itself, to clarify its approaches, to strengthen its unity and to emerge a stronger organization? So that's something that we are going to look at as well. Now, for the post-Cold War era, I thought that it would be good for us to set some benchmarks and some indicators of what the post-Cold War era looks like. I think you might have somewhat dealt with this in IH as well when you deal with the UN content. Look at post-Cold War and Cold War kind of dynamics. Same thing over here as well. We need to define and we need to set some indicators as to what a post-Cold War world looks like. Number one, the ideological veneer unraveled. Now again, bipolarity has collapsed. It is no longer that kind of democracy versus communism, capitalism versus command economy. Those kind of very stark dichotomies, right? It all starts to collapse and things become a lot more fluid. For lack of a better word, things become a lot more acceptable in that sense. What do I mean by that? It will affect Southeast Asia to some degree because actually right from the beginning when ASEAN was formed, they never really did have that ideological character to ASEAN in that they weren't avowed anti-communist. Like the organization didn't state itself to be anti-communist. So actually right from the beginnings of the organization, there was already a lot of pursuance of relationships with communist nations in the region like Vietnam, for instance. But now I think this is given even greater impetus because the same kind of ideological trappings, the stigmas that was with communism in the past, now they don't really have any currency, they don't really apply any longer. So what this results in is a world that is a lot more open, that is bent on pursuing interconnected relationships and things like that. So it gives ASEAN a lot of impetus with regards to the members pursuing the non-members in the region. Geopolitical blocs are also dismantled. Remember what we saw in Southeast Asia with the Cambodian crisis. Remember that one of the big problems with the Cambodian crisis was that there was superpower intervention, and that has all got to do with geopolitics once again. USSR coming in, the USA coming in, China coming in. So we no longer have those kind of geopolitical super blocks anymore, where it can add a layer of complication to things. Do these countries still have a stake in the region? Yes, they do, but not in the same manner of which we saw in the Cold War. So even that component on top of the ideological one is also something that has changed in its character. So another thing about the collapse of the superpower rivalry, at least one of the superpower collapses, the USSR. So the world kind of shifts from having this kind of grand politics of superpower, spheres of influences, containment policy, domino theory, so on and so forth, Sovietization, all those grand politics that we think about with the Cold War. All those things start to lose currency and to just sort of fade into the background a bit, and things start to go to zoom in to the different regions a lot more. So it becomes, rather than it being seen globally, the grand politics of the day now shifts towards a regional focus. So once again, this positively helps ASEAN because there's a lot of momentum for regional level developments. If there is a regional organization like ASEAN, for instance, they would stand to benefit from the collapse of the grand politics of the Cold War. The fourth one, increasing prominence of non-security areas of concern. I think this has partly to do with the Cold War because of, like, point number 2, the geopolitics of the Cold War and all that, proxies and blah blah blah. It has something to do with that, but I think it also has something to do with the way Southeast Asian nations interact. By now, the year is 1991. ASEAN is already 20 plus years old, and I think we can give ASEAN some credit to the way it has socialized the nations to certain regional codes of conduct or certain regional norms of diplomacy. So you see, with that, I think security conflicts between nations occur less frequently. And again, I think that's a testament of what ASEAN has done. That's a testament of how nations have moderated their behavior towards one another. And that's something that also reduces the frequency of security related matters. So instead, what the major issues of the day are shifts from security to other things like, let's say, economic or transboundary issues. And this is mirrored across the world, actually, where on a global scale, I think economics really takes a central position in the wake of the Cold War, and that's why the character of nations interacting with one another starts to modify and starts to change as well. And the last one here, as I mentioned just now, because of the increasing openness, because of the collapse of ideological barriers and geopolitical boundaries and all that kind of stuff, the world is a lot more open and receptive to one another. And therefore, there is a huge focus on multilateralism as well as forging of interdependent relationships. So, for lack of a better word, the world has grown a lot more liberal. It's a lot more open. And yeah, these 5 major pillars over here you see really characterizes the post-Cold War period, and it does set a stage for you as to what kind of context ASEAN is going to operate in. So I hope this is useful for you, not just for this lecture, but as well as for IH if you need it in some manner. Now, the South China Sea conflict, I'm not really going to go into it again. We have a whole lecture and podcast on that, so you can go and check that out. But what I want to emphasize over here is a few things about the character of the South China Sea dispute. So give me a minute. My dog is barking. I'm going to check what is happening. Okay, I'm back. Yep, hungry dog is an angry dog. So, okay, hi, welcome. I'm back. welcome myself. Okay, now going to the South China Sea dispute. The first point over here, the economic and geopolitical collapse of USSR, burgeoning China. I think this has to do with is what I mentioned earlier about that multipolarity that is fast emerging. In the Cold War, it was quite straightforward: USA versus USSR, bipolarity, and all that kind of stuff. But one of the powers that we really need to think about is China. And China is a fast emerging power. I think there are many articles at this point in time, I mean in the 90s, about the awakening dragon, which is China, and the huge economic might and economic power that it has, and it's a huge source of potential. So it does have the ability to influence our region especially, and the developments that take place over there. Um, because of China's increasing might, on its own national level, it does also start to make certain moves. It does also start to take certain steps in order to assert its strength, to assert its dominance, and to assert its influence over the region. And it doesn't just do this through traditional, conventional means like politics, but it also do it through economics. The problem with that ASEAN faces with China, and I think I did mention this quite a bit, is that ASEAN is trying to play a balancing act. Remember that at the core of the organization, the structural limitation here is that ASEAN doesn't have any enforcing mechanisms on its members. It doesn't have any legal kind of statutes or any legal bodies that can force members to do something out of its own will. Against its own will. So I think that the problem here lies with the fact that many, if not all, ASEAN members, and I'm talking even about the newer ones like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, even Myanmar, like all of them have their own bilateral relationships with China, and a lot of this bilateral relationship is hinged on the economy. Why is it so important to them, this China relationship? Is because those nations back then and even till now, they are developing nations. They are what we call a developmental state. And developmental states, they really need a lot of injection of foreign investment. Now China, it's a win-win situation lah. It helps China with regards to their investment and their influence, and at the same time, it helps these Southeast Asian nations as well. So the problem comes in when you take it to a regional level. When you go to the organization and let's say there's a South China Sea conflict, the way to approach China and the way to approach this issue becomes a lot more complicated because there are national interests to consider, and different nations would advocate for different levels of intensity or different levels of aggression, diplomatic aggression, when it comes to meeting and to negotiating with China. So that is a really big problem that ASEAN faces, especially with the South China Sea dispute. The last point over there, the efficacy of the ASEAN diplomacy. This one is about the ASEAN Way principles. Now, the ASEAN Way principles, I need you all to consider this. Does it help or does it hinder ASEAN functioning as an organization? Does it add value to the diplomatic process or does it handicap the organization? Because one of the big things in the South China Sea conflict is that, number one, ASEAN Way approaches could be really slow and actually could not really achieve any meaningful outcomes with regards to tangible concessions from China. So that is one of the biggest criticisms. Another big criticism is that China is using ASEAN Way diplomacy or ASEAN as a diplomatic platform in order to build its own moral legitimacy. Let me explain to you how this works. So even in your notes and in the lecture slides and all that, you can see that China is willing to attend ASEAN platforms, and it's not really willing to talk about the South China Sea directly, but okay, even on the rare occasion that it is, let's say at the Shangri-La Dialogue, or let's say at the ASEAN Regional Forum, like when they do converse and talk about it, right, like it's a way for China to buy itself some what we call political capital, meaning to say that they can say, hey, look, we are engaged in multilateralism. In fact, we are committed to the principles of UNCLOS. They've signed it by now, and so you can't criticize China for not being part of the diplomatic process. We are. So you can see, like, on the surface level, they can engage in such forms of multilateralism and diplomacy. The ASEAN way approaches actually help them in doing so. But I think the problem comes in when China is engaged on all these diplomacy on one side, but on the other side, they are continuing on their physical expansion in the South China Sea, which means to say that they are continuing their assertion of their own nine-dash line. So there's kind of a dual diplomacy over here. In some measure, it is a bit conflicting, and that's another layer that ASEAN can't really overcome at this moment, or even back then. How to align China's foreign policy to be one that is consistent with its public, show at multilateral platforms. So the key thing for ASEAN in trying to deal with China is really to get China socialized to international law. And hopefully their idea is that with China socializing itself to international law, it would conform to its standards and all that kind of stuff, and then it can help to bridge a way forward in diplomacy over the South China Sea and trying to untangle that whole mess over there. So ASEAN's main approach is really to get China to be socialized to international law as well as to multilateralism, to keep China at the diplomatic table, hoping that it would modify its behavior. So I think this is the biggest challenge that ASEAN has with the South China Sea. It's just really the complexity of international diplomacy, and especially with a power like China, it is something that ASEAN really has to navigate very, very carefully. What's going for ASEAN is that ASEAN has just come out of a rather successful management of the Cambodian conflict, and right now ASEAN's acclaim and credibility are rather decent, quite high actually, and they are going to continue to build on this. The ASEAN Way principles, I need you all to realize that the ASEAN Way principles still today, they haven't really modified in any significant way. Now, from a functionalist point of view, if there is a function to these principles and approaches, then there isn't a need for them to be modified or for them to be eradicated. That means to say that there is a function, there is a value to the ASEAN Way principles and approaches. And I challenge you guys to craft arguments to show how the ASEAN Way principles are actually effective and actually aid the organization in dealing with the South China Sea issue. Now, the second big thing that happens in the 1990s with regards to ASEAN, this has something to do with ASEAN's organizational structure, and it concerns that key issue of membership. Now remember, we take it all the way back to 1967 when we assess the reason for ASEAN's formation, the raison d'etre of ASEAN, raison d'etre. Okay, I'm probably mispronouncing this French term, but yeah, you can Google it and listen how it's really pronounced. But this term means the reason for existence. Now remember, the reason for existence of ASEAN is to be a representative organization. The previous organizations weren't representative enough, and therefore they couldn't really represent the region's interests. But ASEAN is that one organization that really had a political will to be that representative institution. Now, till the entirety of the Cold War period, till 1991, we only have 6 members. The sixth member was Brunei. That means to say that there are 4 other members in the region right now which are not part of this regional organization. Obviously, that is a flaw. That's a problem for ASEAN, because how can it claim to be a representative organization if there are nations that are outside? the organization. Which is why actually from 1967, earlier I said, ASEAN has been in constant pursuance of these relationships. It has never really shut any nation out from membership. I think the issue was more to do with timing than it was about whether you can enter or not. So right now, again, with the post-Cold War environment, it does seem like it's the perfect time for greater momentum for the inclusion of newer members. One of the key impetus, as it was in 1967 and I think as it is now in the 1990s, it was the economic agenda. Again, common baseline, keep in mind that the newer members, they are of different political systems as well. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, they are all communist nations. Myanmar is basically military rule. So you can see that there isn't a lot of commonality baseline kind of stuff that you can find among the nations. But one thing that you can be sure of is economics. And once again, economics is a huge boost towards enlargement of ASEAN and the expansion of these of the organization. So in 1995, Vietnam joined, Laos and Myanmar in 1997, and finally Cambodia in 1999. There are some issues that determines why they are staggered, the dates like 95, 97, 99. Don't think I'll go to it into this podcast, but perhaps you'll cover it in consults or something like that. Because there are some issues to do with what's happening within these countries itself. Yeah, so that's something for another time. Now, with the inclusion of newer members, it does seem like it's quite straightforward. Or newer members got like more representation, or there's more like economic potential and opportunities and all that. Yeah, okay, cool, sure, there's that side. But I think the inclusion of newer members presents a lot of challenges as well. Like, I just give you an example. You can categorize them into the three things that I gave you here, political, economic, organizational. But going by the countries, right? Let's say Vietnam. Vietnam, I think I've talked to you about it quite a number of times already with regards to the South China Sea. Now, Vietnam is one of the major disputants with China. They are willing to take an aggressive approach. In fact, they want to take an aggressive approach with regards to the guarding of their sovereignty. So, when it comes to ASEAN and crafting of their statements and all that, Vietnam is always going to push for something more than what other ASEAN members, the non-disputants or the non-claimants, are willing to do. So that kind of creates a lot of structural disunity, and it does make the whole diplomatic process a really long, drawn-out one. More devastatingly, it can piss off Vietnam, and Vietnam can bypass ASEAN channels and engage in their own unilateral or their own bilateral avenues. So then that throws the credibility of ASEAN into question, because its own member state is not really using its platforms and is going by its own way and that kind of stuff. So that kind of problems lah. Myanmar, for instance, Myanmar right now, I'm sure you all know Aung San Suu Kyi and all that, but I think the larger issue that is going on in Myanmar right now is that there are huge humanitarian issues with regards to the persecution of certain sections of the population, and pro-democracy people, populace within Myanmar. ASEAN is facing a difficult task here, because when ASEAN offers Myanmar a hand of friendship and say that, hey, join our organization, we welcome you, blah blah blah, to the international community, this looks really, really weird, because here you have Myanmar who is persecuting its own citizens, and yet ASEAN is extending that hand of friendship. So it's a bit contradictory lah, or it's a bit conflicting, and it's a bit puzzling as well. It's as if ASEAN is condoning, or at least casting a blind eye to what Myanmar is doing back on its own home front. So that creates a lot of credibility issues for ASEAN as well. The key thing for you to try to figure out is, why does ASEAN continue to pursue the Burmese relationship despite all these things? And actually, does the Burmese relationship help ASEAN in any way? So yeah, these are some examples of problems that the newer members can bring into ASEAN as well. Now, Um, just now I talked to you about the expansion of the organization. Now I want to talk to you about the extension of the organization. Now, in the 1990s, ASEAN extends itself through a number of subsidiary forums. We've already been through one of them in the economic sphere, and that was AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area. And here we have another one, but this time around, this one is specifically for the security sphere, and this is the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ARF. Now, I think the principle behind the extension of ASEAN to create these new subsidiary bodies, it's consistent across the security and the economic sphere. I think number one, ASEAN is in a stronger position to conceptualize and to implement these kind of extensions. They have the credibility with them by this stage, some measure of credibility, enough to extend all these things, and they have huge political will. The agency and the leadership of ASEAN in these two organizations is quite substantial. The the absence of the Cold War or the end of the Cold War in this new post-Cold War environment allows ASEAN to take the leadership as well, because you don't have that kind of superpower bipolarity any longer, and the focus on the region means that regional organizations can take the lead, and they do take the lead in these kind of multilateral initiatives. So the ARF is a security-related extension forum initiated by ASEAN. Remember, they are fresh out of confidence from managing the Cambodian conflict. The South China Sea is already, the dispute is really ongoing and all that kind of stuff, but there's a huge level of confidence in ASEAN in terms of security management. So this ASEAN Regional Forum is something that I think it's really quite credible, and by the way, it lasts all the way till today. Now, the concept here is that leaders of the 1990s, leaders of the post-Cold War era, they believe that in the future, the type of conflict or the type of warfare is not on the grand scale of like the Cold War or World War II or World War I anymore. It's going to be smaller conflicts. It might be protracted. Protracted means that it might be very, very, very long. But it's going to be on a small scale kind of thing. And these small scale conflicts, they could exacerbate regional tensions, and therefore the regional organization should be the one to manage these kind of things. So they need other dedicated bodies like the ARF in order to manage these kind of issues. It is very much modeled on ASEAN principles. So even with the ARF, there isn't those kind of like it's based on that informal diplomacy style of approach, non-binding, non-enforceable, no, there's no P5, there's no Security Council or whatever. It is very much modeled on the ASEAN Way principles, which once again allows me to go back to ask you the question as to how come, despite all the criticism towards ASEAN Way principles, it continues to survive, and not only that, it continues to thrive. So that's a big thing for you to consider right there. The comprehensive approach that ASEAN has is also seen in the ARF. To deal with security issues, you have to think about the economics, the social, the political forces that can contribute to the management of security. So that is the ASEAN comprehensive approach to managing any type of issue. It's always a holistic approach, taking it from many different angles. The ARF is a really, really, in my opinion, it's something to be really proud of that ASEAN created. There are the major powers of the world at that point in time are in the ARF. USA, China, Japan. I just give you a testament of the ARF. North Korea is in the ARF. I mean, to get a hermit kingdom out into international multilateral diplomacy, to a forum, and one that is frequent, one that is structured, I think that's quite an amazing feat lah, if you want my opinion on it. But it does give you the indication of how much currency the ARF has. The ARF as I said, it's modeled on ASEAN way approaches. But if you want to have a more um, specific instruction or a specific kind of philosophy from the ARF, actually they have a three-tier management process. The first one is confidence building measures or CBMs. Second one is preventive diplomacy, and the third one is conflict resolution. Now, honestly, with regards to this three-tier approach, it's a guideline and it's kind of the ideal situation. You move from CBMs to PD and then finally to resolution. Um, I mean that's the guideline, and I think it's pretty coherent, and it's also pretty applicable to the type of conflicts and the context of the nations operating in the Pacific region. So I think in terms of theory, this is a really sound kind of diplomatic philosophy. In actuality, however, I think with regards to progress, it has been a bit slow, especially in the 1990s, where more or less nations were stuck at stage one with the CBMs, still trying to build up confidence and trust among nations. Preventive diplomacy is more like, oh, you get into such a alignment of your behavior and your norms of conduct that you can prevent conflicts from happening in the first place. I don't think we've got to that stage lah. So I think we are still at the CBM's kind of phase at that point in time. But this gives you an indication lah, to show you the kind of philosophy, the kind of diplomatic philosophy that operates in the ARF. The fact that international actors and the large powers, I'm talking about USA, China, the Russia, Japan, the fact that these nations, the UK, the fact that these nations all subscribe to this kind of diplomacy shows a good amount of respect, but it also shows a good amount of the applicability and the viability of ASEAN Way principles in trying to resolve regional or even international level kind of disputes.
In Southeast Asia, there is a major land and Vietnam and Cambodia, Brunei, Vietnam and Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand and Philippines. Then what?
Haze. The next two issues are going to be termed or categorized under this thing called transboundary issues. The first one is transboundary pollution. I don't think I really need to explain to you all what the haze is and how it's begun and how it started and blah blah blah. We've been through this a bit already. But together, you see, the haze and later on the next one, which is on something to do with Burma, it is a really, really touchy issue and it's a really complicated one to approach because transboundary issues, the genesis of the issue, the conflict, it usually emanates from one nation and it's usually to do with its domestic politics. The problem here comes with ASEAN's principle of non-interference. So taking this haze issue for instance, the forest fires, they emanate from Indonesia, from various parts of Kalimantan and Sumatra. But this comes down to Indonesian economic practices. This comes down to Indonesian political governance over these areas and the licenses given to the companies that are slashing and burning. Now, because of ASEAN's principle of non-interference, it is unable to tell Indonesia how to manage its country. Like, that's not what ASEAN is set out to do. And the principle of non-interference, it actually safeguards member states from receiving these kinds of like direct impositions. But at the same time, because the core of the issue can't be resolved or can't be, directly addressed, it does slow down the whole diplomatic process. I'm not saying that they can't talk about it. It is raised as an agenda, but because of the non-direct manner of the approaches, the solutions, the remedies, it does slow down the entire thing. But yet, non-interference as a principle continues all the way till today. Once again, think about why so? What's so important about non-interference, and why is it? I think by this time it is a sacred principle of ASEAN. Is a sacred cow. It's not going to be moved. Why so? Why so? The third point over here, there's this thing called you can see ASEAN Agency in Action, Track 1, Track 1.5, Track 2. Now, despite this principle of non-interference, and they can't, deal with Indonesian domestic politics like directly and that kind of stuff, ASEAN still tries to find different ways in which to try to deal with the issue, but in a more constructive manner, in a more like how can we help the situation kind of manner. I think tensions will always be there. There are tensions. I'm not saying there aren't, but it's more of how can we help the situation to benefit everybody in the region. I think that's one of the things that I'm really proud of ASEAN in their regional management. Is that there's always that cordiality, there's always that amity, that friendship, and it's more of like, hey, let's come together and see how we can work things through. For the benefit of everyone in the region. Now, Track 1, Track 1.5, Track 2. These are different diplomatic avenues, different diplomatic channels and levels of which ASEAN can approach any given situation. Now, Track 1 approaches are governmental approaches. That means these are at the elite level meetings, foreign ministers, prime ministers, economic ministers, so on, and it's all government. Track 1.5 is when you have a mixture of government officials and non-government officials. So the non-government officials can be like specialists in the field of, in this case, let's say like the environment. It can be like think tanks, or it can be like people who can help in putting out the fires, that kind of stuff. So it's a mixture of government and non-government. And then Track 2 is mostly non-government personnel coming together to discuss how they can best approach the situation. Now, Track 2 is not entirely useless, or it's not like, just an academic exercise. Like whatever that is discussed in Track 2, the recommendations and the proposals can be brought up to Track 1.5 or to Track 1 and eventually be, discussed and debated among the elite officials. And it may be implemented like eventually. Usually that's the case. So this whole thing can be quite cyclical as well. That's how ASEAN tries to circumnavigate this idea of non-interference by creating non-threatening but more constructive kind of avenues in order for states to give mutual assistance and help to one another without contravening on the principle of non-interference. So, is it a point of weakness or does it continue to be a strength? This idea of non-interference is up for debate. You can think about it. Quite an interconnected kind of issue is to do with, I did talk a bit about this just now, about the Burmese humanitarian crisis. So basically what's happening in Burma right now is, at that point in time, is that from 1988, kind of from that point onwards, Burma is in a quite unstable state of politics because there are pro-democracy movements, and most prominently led by Aung San Suu Kyi. But there have been massive suppression. The military government suppress all these movements and all that. There are a lot of humanitarian kind of episodes that are coming out of these suppressive activities. Aung San Suu Kyi is under house arrest, and Aung San Suu Kyi at that point in time is the Western darling. Like they love her, and she's an icon of democracy, and oh my god, she's under house arrest. How can Myanmar do this, and blah 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 blah. So that's the kind of spirit at that point in time in which the whole situation is viewed in. And so ASEAN was heavily condemned, and ASEAN was heavily criticized for continuing their extension of membership to Myanmar. And so there was a damage of ASEAN's credibility somewhat because the Western world was looking at the situation and they couldn't understand, and they were quite quick to criticize ASEAN for giving, not excited. Drop my earphone. They were criticizing ASEAN for not doing more to kind of like manage the situation in Myanmar. But again, going back to the idea of non-interference, I don't think ASEAN was ever in a position to do so. By their mandate, they are not. And I think that ASEAN's strategy was quite unique and quite different, and I think it's quite novel lah. So it's not something the Western world might have understood or whatever. I'm not too sure, but the idea was that we should continue our membership efforts for Myanmar. I mean, they should continue to join the organization, and from within the organization, hopefully Myanmar will be socialized towards more humanitarian norms or democratic norms even. I'm not too sure, but the idea was to moderate Myanmar from within the organization. So in their conceptualization, in their idea, it was much better for Myanmar to be part of the organization and for ASEAN to deal with this situation than for Myanmar to be outside of the organization and for ASEAN to deal with the situation through many different layers of diplomacy. So I think that's why the Myanmar membership continued to be facilitated and pushed all the way to 1997. I mean, hashtag ASEAN Pride over here moment is in the face of international condemnation, or criticism, ASEAN continues to stand its ground, and the ASEAN Way principles, it never does waver. So that's something I think really quite commendable. This one I've been through a bit in tutorials already, and I just want to emphasize the third decade of the regional economic cooperation and development. In particular, just now I wanted to emphasize on the ASEAN Free Trade Area. So the ASEAN Free Trade Area is quite like the ARF that we dealt with earlier. It's an extension, but this one is for the economic side of things. It is a really sizable initiative, and it does give a lot of impetus to the openness and the liberalization of economies in Southeast Asia. It does facilitate a substantial increase in the movement of goods and services across the area. So it's again a mutual benefit kind of stuff. There are some complications with regards to AFTA and the newer members joining the organization, because long story short, the newer members, they are in a different state of economy and they cannot meet the AFTA timetable for the liberalization of economy. So there are some slowdown over there, but ASEAN manages to overcome that as well. I'll save that for another time. And the last one I want to talk about is the 1997 Asian financial crisis. This one, I think it gave the region PTSD, and I think it gave me PTSD as well, because the Asian financial crisis, the whole world thought that it was going to come out, but it didn't. Neither in SBQ nor in the essay. So sucks. Anyway. The Asian financial crisis is another one of those areas where it's, non-security spheres of concern, and once again it does touch upon the ASEAN principle of non-interference as well. I think the problem here or the issue here, right, was quite like the other ones, which is that saying a lot of international scrutiny and condemnation, saying like, actually even from the region itself, saying like, why doesn't ASEAN do more to help the economies, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. Well, the point is that ASEAN is not, I don't know if it's within the mandate of ASEAN to save economies from crisis, and I don't think it's, found anywhere in their documents or whatever, that, ASEAN is not the IMF or, that kind of stuff. Then the Asian financial crisis is something to do with national economies, so kind of the national economies got themselves into the fix, and the national economies have to find some way to get out of it. Does ASEAN have a role to play, and should ASEAN have a role to play in this? Yes, I believe so. But I think it's more of a long-term role towards recovery and rehabilitation than anything to do with a quick fix, than anything to do with like an injection of a sum of funding and assistance. I don't think it's to do with that. But it's more of ASEAN having that long-term role to continue to build up the economic health of societies and to be able to foster greater cooperation so that the nations could recover and that the health of the economies could be more robust lah, in that sense. So with regards to the regional economy, that's something that ASEAN has had to deal with, the growth of it as well as in meeting these kind of crises. And I think that well, it's something for you to also look at and to investigate and to come to your own conclusions whether ASEAN managed the regional economy well, including the Asian financial crisis of 97. So I think that this kind of concludes the SBQ series that we have. I will revisit SBQ sometime in, I think, towards the end of term 2, start of term 3, where we'll go into revision. So in the meantime, guys, you all do what you all can. You have like 7 or 8 SPQs with you right now, so please try them, arrange consults and all that, and we'll discuss them during the consults. I had a great term 1 with you guys, batch of 2020, and I know that it was difficult given the whole COVID situation and all that. And I'm looking forward to term 2 actually, because I can't wait to see what I can do with you guys and how far you all can go. Because as I told you, I do have high hopes for your batch, and I just want us to continue working towards that. We need to up the intensity a bit. Term 1 was about 60% maybe. Now we got to crank it up to about 70, maybe 75. But we are not taking it to 100 just yet. So pace yourself, take care, and I'll see y'all in school real soon.